Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into one of the most confounding, mythic, and honestly fiercely debated figures in all of American history, John Brown. We're going to take a really close look at a man who pushed a deeply divided nation to finally confront its absolute deepest moral contradictions. It's an intense story, full of radicalism, faith, violence, and the ultimate cost of freedom. Okay, let's jump right into this.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. A polarizing American figure. 2. The vow against slavery. 3. Violence in Bleeding Kansas. 4. The Harpers Ferry raid. 5. Trial and martyrdom. And 6. An enduring, complex legacy.
All right, starting with Section 1, a polarizing American figure.
You know, it's truly rare for one single individual to leave such a deeply fractured footprint on a nation. For over a century and a half now, John Brown has basically been pushed into two extreme archetypes. To white Southerners of his era, he was this monomaniacal terrorist, a totally obsessed madman who brought their absolute worst nightmares of insurrection to life. But to many Northern abolitionists, he was revered as a martyred saint. Now, I know exploring a figure like this can bring up a lot of internal resistance, but stick with me here. We're going to look strictly at the historical sources to really understand his internal logic. We aren't here to endorse his methods, but rather to neutrally examine the events that forged those unyielding convictions of his.
Moving on to Section 2, the vow against slavery.
To really get this guy, we have to rewind to his formative years. Born in 1800 into a super strict Calvinist family, Brown's early life was totally defined by the frontier. But in 1812, when he was just 12 years old, he actually watched a young enslaved boy get brutally beaten with an iron shovel. And that trauma haunted him, sparking a lifelong hatred of slavery. Fast forward a bit, and we see a man just plagued by profound tragedy. He fathered 20 children, but tragically, many of them died in infancy. On top of that, he suffered massive business failures, which eventually culminated in an 1842 bankruptcy. Historians actually suggest that this restless, unsettled life of his stripped away conventional ambitions, and instead focused him entirely on what he deeply believed was a sacred divine obligation.
And that brings us to a huge, pivotal turning point. In 1837, a pro-slavery mob out in Illinois murdered an abolitionist editor named Elijah Lovejoy. At a memorial service for Lovejoy, Brown stood up and made this solemn declaration. This wasn't just him expressing grief, it was practically a formal declaration of war. Because up until then, mainstream abolitionists relied mostly on moral suasion, peaceful persuasion. But Brown looked around and concluded that these men were all talk and that the era demanded real action.
Now, here's an absolutely crucial point to understand. Brown wasn't just against the legal institution of slavery, he actually believed in true, fundamental equality, which was incredibly rare for white abolitionists at the time. In 1849, he moved his family out to North Elba, New York, to live in a farming community for free African Americans called Timbuktu, which had been founded by the philanthropist Gerrit Smith. Out there, Brown lived as a true peer to his black neighbors. He ate at their tables and treated them with a kind of revolutionary respect. It was this experience that solidified his vision for a future post-slavery government based on genuine egalitarianism.
That takes us to Section 3, violence in Bleeding Kansas. As we head into the 1850s, I want you to pause for a second and consider this question. What happens when peaceful protests fail? It's a really heavy question for sure, but it's essential if we want to understand the historical dilemma of this specific era. Because the peaceful abolitionist efforts, they were actively failing. The expansion of slavery wasn't just some abstract political debate happening in Washington, it was being actively enforced with brutal, systemic violence on the ground.
Let's look at the facts. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act let local settlers vote on whether Kansas would be a free or slave state. Well, that literally invited an armed migration. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri poured over the border using massive voter fraud and physical violence against anti-slavery settlers, which included Brown's own sons. Then, in May 1856, pro-slavery forces completely sacked the Free State town of Lawrence, just burning buildings to the ground. That very same month, an anti-slavery senator, Charles Sumner, was brutally beaten with a cane right on the floor of the U.S. Senate by a Southern congressman. Brown watched all of this and saw that pro-slavery forces were striking first. To him, the Free State response looked dangerously passive.
So Brown's retaliation was swift and frankly shocking. On May 24, 1856, he led a small party to Pottawatomie Creek. Using heavy broadswords, specifically so they wouldn't make the sound of gunfire, his men dragged 5 pro-slavery men from their homes and hacked them to death. Now, while undeniably horrifying, Brown actually viewed this not as murder, but as a divine judicial execution meant to strike terror straight into the pro-slavery factions. From there, the violence just spiraled. In June, Brown tactically outmaneuvered a much larger pro-slavery militia at the Battle of Blackjack. By August, he was courageously defending the town of Pottawatomie against over 250 pro-slavery fighters. Even though his son Frederick was killed and the town was ultimately burned, this is exactly where the fearsome legend of Pottawatomie Brown, the guerrilla commander, was born.
Section 4. The Harpers Ferry Raid. By this point, Brown was totally done with territory-level skirmishes. He was ready to strike directly at the heart of the South. But before the actual raid, Brown proved he was way more than just a guerrilla fighter. He was acting like a radical statesman. In 1858, while he was secretly staying at the home of Frederick Douglass, he actually drafted a provisional constitution. It mapped out a completely new egalitarian state right in the Appalachian Mountains that outright forbade slavery and granted equal rights regardless of race or sex. Scholars call this concept fringe constitutionalism. He genuinely, truly envisioned replacing what he saw as an illegitimate government with a truly democratic one.
Of course, to execute this massive master plan of seizing the federal armory at Harpers Ferry and then arming a fugitive slave army, Brown needed money. The men you see listed right here were known as the Secret Six. They were prominent Northern elites, intellectuals, and philanthropists, and they provided the thousands of dollars Brown needed to purchase hundreds of Sharps rifles and specially made pikes. So Brown's insurrection wasn't just some totally rogue lone wolf mission. It actually had significant, albeit quiet, institutional backing from the North.
We absolutely have to highlight the men who marched with him too. On October 16, 1859, Brown led 22 men down toward the armory. While Brown is obviously the famous name, the 5 African-American raiders listed here were absolutely vital to the mission. Dangerfield Newby was a former slave fighting specifically to buy his wife's freedom. Shields Green had lived with Frederick Douglass. Copeland was a college student. Leary was a free harness maker. And Anderson, well, he was the only black raider to actually escape and later write an eyewitness account of the whole thing. Their presence is so important because it proves that Brown was deeply, genuinely trusted by the very people he was seeking to liberate.
All right, Section 5, Trial and Martyrdom. So, tactically speaking, the raid completely failed. The local enslaved population didn't rise up like he hoped, and U.S. Marines, actually led by Robert E. Lee, battered down the engine house doors and captured a severely wounded Brown. But what happens next literally changes American history. Virginia fast-tracked his trial for treason and murder. Naturally, Brown's defense team frantically tried to save his life by pleading insanity, pointing to his erratic behavior and a known family history of mental illness, but Brown vehemently rejected it. He completely understood the massive historical stage he was currently standing on. If he pleaded insane, his righteous war against slavery would just be dismissed as the ramblings of a madman. So he maintained this incredibly cool self-possession that absolutely stunned the entire courtroom. On November 2nd, after the jury found him guilty, Brown delivered what is arguably one of the most famous speeches in all of American history. Picture this. He's lying on a cot, still bleeding from his wounds, and he tells the court that interfering on behalf of God's despised poor was not wrong but right. He looked at them and said, "Now if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, I submit, so let it be done." By basically dropping the sword and picking up the pen, his month in prison utterly galvanized Northern abolitionists. It transformed him into an absolute public martyr. Then, on the morning of his execution, December 2nd, 1859, he was led out to the gallows. Right as he left his cell, he handed a short note to a guard. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." It's literally a chilling foreshadowing of the immense, nation-tearing violence that was right around the corner. Finally, Section 6, an enduring, complex legacy.
So what should we really take away from all of this? How did his actions ripple out through time? Well, just look at this number. It is staggering. Just 16 months, exactly 16 months after John Brown was hanged, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had officially begun. His bloody prophecy turned out to be terrifyingly accurate. To Southerners, Brown was the ultimate proof that the North wanted their total destruction, which rapidly accelerated the formation of Confederate militias. But for the North, he was the smoldering spark that finally ignited the conflict needed to destroy slavery once and for all.
If you fast forward a century to the Civil Rights Movement, we see Brown's methods continuing to spark profound debate. Malcolm X actually cited Brown as the only white man he respected. He admired Brown's willingness to literally risk his own life and shed blood for black freedom, rather than just preaching nonviolence to people who were actively being oppressed. On the flip side, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was deeply fascinated by Brown's martyrdom.
He viewed Brown's willing death on the gallows as this powerful form of redemptive, creative suffering, which helped pave the way for the direct action tactics of the 1960s. So you have two incredible leaders, looking through totally different lenses, but both recognizing his immense impact.
And that brings us right here to the end. John Brown is like the ultimate embodiment of that fundamental tension between law and morality. Think about it. When a legal system is deeply, inherently unjust, as slavery absolutely was, what is the acceptable cost to break it? He was a man who turned to extreme violence when democratic avenues completely failed, but he did it pursuing a radically equal society that, honestly, we're still striving for today. So I'll leave it with this to chew on. How do we measure the cost of justice? Does the ultimate achievement of freedom justify the violent spark that ignited it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.